My name's Kate. I'm one of the digital project coordinators on the Digital Sporting Story project along with Belinda. I'm just going to do a quick bit of webinar etiquette before I hand over to Belinda to properly introduce today. As I say, use the chat throughout. If you have any thoughts or questions that crop up as we go along, pop them in. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the very end, but there might be some points that Russell asks as we go along, and just get involved as and when. Just keep your mics off throughout. As I say, you can keep your cameras on. We are going to be recording this, so your faces will show up if you keep your cameras on, as long as you're happy with that. You don't need to scribble down lots and lots of notes, as we will send out the slides along with some handouts and a companion guide after the session. If you want to tweet as we're going through, just make sure you tag @sportinghistory. And it probably works best if you have it on speaker view rather than gallery view, so that you'll just have the presenter showing up rather than all of our faces. But I'll hand over to Belinda now, and I'll speak to you in the chat.
Hi, I'm Belinda. So as Kate said, I'm another of the digital project coordinators for Sporting Heritage CIC. And just to give you a bit of background about the project, we started this a few months ago. It's been funded by Art Fund UK, and it's in response to the pandemic really, and the recognition that the sporting heritage sector needs potentially some more skills in how to share their collections and stories online. So we started with a filmmaking series back in the summer, and now we've moved on to podcasting and how to help people with their podcasting skills. And the main part of the presentation today will be with Russell Todd, who is the podcaster in residence for Sporting Heritage CIC. And he will have about 45 minutes to explain how to get started with podcasting. And as Kate said, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And Kate and I will also introduce a couple of potential activities and some more work that we're doing into 2021 around the Digital Skills Project and how you can get involved in that as well. So I'll hand over to Russell, and just like any questions you have or any comments, please just put them in the chat as we go through. Okay, Russell.
Thank you, Belinda. Thank you, Kate. Let's just share the screen. Hopefully everybody can see this. Hopefully everybody can see a slide with a big, shiny, retro-looking mic on the left-hand side. There's my contact details. They'll crop up at the end as well, and all sorts of emails and things going out. Just a bit of a nod to Art Fund and to Sport and Heritage as well for supporting this. By way of my sort of background, I fell into podcasting, I suppose, back in about 2013, 2014, started the first podcast dedicated to the Wales football team. I'm based in Cardiff, a bit of a football nut, but a bit of a sports nut more generally. And I've always had an interest in the heritage side of sport and how sport and culture interact, and aspects of society, and sport as that medium for some of those things and some of those topics. Learned through doing, which I think most people do with this medium, made any number of mistakes along the way. But my background in terms of career is in community development and community work, primarily in Wales, but not exclusively, in areas of disadvantage. And I was looking for podcast media around community work, around community development, couldn't find anything. So in the best sort of in the spirit, I suppose, of that discipline, of that work, I started on myself, and I really enjoy that. Helps me connect, really good learning resource. Those are just labours of love, I suppose. They're not commercial ventures. I make no money off the back of those, but they do open the doors to other opportunities. And here's a range of different kind of outlets that I've either contributed to or I've produced podcasts for, both in English and Welsh. And where it's been, for example, organisations like WCVA does tend to be the sort of third sector, voluntary sector, community sector. So hopefully with today's webinar, what I'm hoping we will achieve is that you understand the sort of the principal elements for a successful sport and heritage podcast. So if you have some ideas, you are curious as to how this medium might help you connect and engage, reach a broader audience, whatever else you want to achieve with it, hopefully we're going to help put those building blocks into place and into some sort of order to give you a firm foundation to build on. Specifically, we're going to then look at what you want to say with your podcast. both in terms of specific content from episode to episode, but more broadly in terms of that voice, that identity that you might want to develop. We're going to consider who you'd like to reach and who you'd want to engage with that podcast. There's a lot to be said for just doing it because it's a fun thing to do. But at the end of the day, I suppose we all do these things because we want to be heard. We want to be listened to. We might have specific asks that we want people to do off the back of the podcast. And so it's important we are clear on who we'd like to reach. We will look at how you can prepare the content of individual episodes and throughout your sort of podcast channels, but also as well how you prepare the participants, because that's absolutely key. People might be the most enthusiastic, the most passionate, the most knowledgeable about a particular aspect of sport and heritage, but if they feel like they've been dropped in at the deep end, they'll clam up, they'll be a bit nervous, and they won't really make the most of the opportunity that they have and you're presenting them. And then we'll identify what success means. You know, how do we know a podcast is working? This is actually quite hard, and it can take a bit of time to understand what that success looks like and what it might look like. So we're going to talk through a few of those sort of elements as well. What we won't be covering, not really going to cover things like equipment and the hardware, things like that. Certainly not going to make recommendations for purchase. I tend to get asked sometimes, well, I'm thinking of buying this mic or that mic. I'm not an expert on the technology, to be honest. I know what works for me, but maybe after today, more than happy to provide some feedback. But that's not something we're covering today. We're not going to record anything today, and we're not going to cover any of the practical elements of editing in detail. It's just not for today. It's going to be covered in the tutorial that's following this in a week or two's time. And we're not going to explore any alternatives to SoundCloud. The reason we're focusing on SoundCloud is that that's what Sporting Heritage, the CIC, has invested some time in developing their channel, which we'll come to in a moment. There's tons and tons and tons of them, but you can have a reach and you can broaden your canvas from SoundCloud. So that's what we're focusing on. So I asked people, invited people to just provide some answers, some feedback, I suppose, give me an idea of what sort of engagement people have had with podcasts previously or usually. So feel free to add this in the chat. How often do people listen to podcasts? Do they listen daily? Maybe once or twice a week. They've listened occasionally, maybe only once or twice. And there's always people, whenever I do these sorts of things, who've never listened to one at all. So I'm kind of curious as to what people's engagement has been. I do have a theory that during lockdown this year, engagement has probably increased because people have had a bit more sort of downtime, I suppose, or they're working a little bit more isolatedly, and podcasts perhaps give that sense of sociability because it's people talking in your ears. Yeah, there's a look in the chat, let's call that up. I tend to not listen to them all that often because I tend to find, and this is something that any budding podcaster probably needs to recognise at the outset, the more you're having to make them and produce them, the less time you have to listen to them, unfortunately. So it does mean that I tend to fall behind on those that I do listen to. I was curious as well as to whether anyone's ever participated in a podcast, because it's one thing listening to them, but it's another thing taking part in them, let alone producing them, being the person in the hot seat who's making sure that everyone is happy, that everyone has been prepared, who's got the editing to do, the hosting and everything else. And what I tend to find with these is that very, very rarely, if at all, the people have been involved in that. So one of the things I would always encourage people to do, if they are curious in starting one for their own heritage organisation, for their own museum, for example, would be to maybe look to take part in once you get a feel for the process, before you are responsible for producing them, for making them. A few people coming in. Just catch up on the background. I've got a range of sports here as well. Cool. It's part of the podcast last week, really enjoyed it. Oh, cool, okay. Were there any technical issues, Anita? Because sometimes that can put people off, or just sort of sit there, relax, and just impart your wisdom, because ideally that's what you prepare. That's how you set up the conditions, and that's how you prepare the guests to do. You start listening already during lockdown. Yeah. That's something I'm seeing an awful lot. I've got a slide in a moment's time with listener data from Ofcom, because Ofcom now collates data related to podcast consumption, podcast listening, not just radio. They've been doing that, I think, about 3 or 4 years. it's the date usually comes out September, and I've been keeping an eye out for it this last couple of days to see if there was anything that I could maybe squeeze into this to be a bit more contemporary, but I haven't seen it yet.
Stay here, Herman, because you're already here. So, okay, because I
yeah, please keep your mics off. If you have any questions to ask, as Kate said at the start, please drop them into the chat and I'll answer them, or we'll sort of collate them to the end. In terms of sport and heritage, the CIC's engagement in podcasts, we first produced some at the 2017 conference in Bradford, where I did a presentation around them as a potential media, because I come at it from very much from an angle, not a commercial angle at all. I come at it from an angle of community media. My background is community work. It gives people a little bit more of empowerment to manage their message, to manage their stories, to communicate their stories without having to go through maybe a media or press sort of middleman, so to speak. We then did them again subsequently at the Liverpool and the Cardiff conferences, 2018 and 19. But since then, and since I think how well they've been received, the medium has been written into specific projects. So we've had some podcasts around the Armed Forces project that was running, has sort of been curtailed a little bit this year because of everything that's been going on. But then also the Sport England, the Women's and Disability Sport project as well. And so what we've done is collated under specific playlists on the SoundCloud channel, which I'll come to in a bit, so that people can find specifically the content related to individual projects. And we've also done standalone episodes, and they tend to kind of happen as and when the opportunity arises. So I did one during lockdown with my next door neighbour, who is in his 80s, Colin, and who was a member of the athletics team at Aberystwyth University in the 1950s, 40 years before I was a student there. It was just nice just to kind of reminisce about that, and I sort of contrasted the opportunity to be part of an American football team in the 90s when I was there, which obviously wasn't something that Colin had an opportunity to do in the 50s. It was much more the traditional sort of British sports, if you like. And so, as I said, we've populated that channel. There's more stuff on there all the time. So we've put two up this week. One was for the Hockey Museum promoting or helping to promote and celebrate National Sporting Heritage Day, which was yesterday. And we did one with, as part of the Disability Women's Sport Project, we did one with Frances Horton, the 5-time Olympian, and with Catherine Robson from the River Rowing Museum in Henley. So if you've had a chance to listen to those, then feel free to drop in your thoughts. We always, we want the feedback. We want these to be of interest and of use and of relevance to people. If you haven't, then maybe now's the time, and hopefully today's the motivation to take part in some of those. Just incidentally, yesterday was probably the busiest day. We'll know probably about it. It wasn't the busiest day in terms of streams of podcasts, which was great because it was showing that when you do something that's focused like Sport and Heritage Day, people are acting on the content. They're then going, okay, I'm going to go on and take those steps and listen to something, and that was great. So we had the busiest day by far yesterday. I did try to upload a glossary to the files, and I'm not sure if it's worked, but I'll get that through to you somehow. It is a bit of a technical process, so inevitably there is some jargon. So what I've done is I've prepared that glossary that helps just demystify a little bit. But please say if there's anything you're not clear on in terms of terminologies, then please say. There's not a stupid question when it comes to this. I do try to get rid of the jargon as much as possible, but some of it does hang around, unfortunately. So, okay, so what is a podcast? Quite simply, it's a digital audio file made available on the internet for downloading to a PC or a portable media player, of which there are now numerous sorts. You've got smart speakers, smartphones, MP3 players, and so on. The origins of the word are quite simply pod, as in iPod, and cast from broadcast. And it's as simple as that. However, they might have been called something else, because in this link, which you'll get, which I encourage you to read because it's a curious, it's a bit of a curiosity, the way it came about. This is a technology journalist with The Guardian, Ben Hammersley, dapper looking chap, and he coined the term podcast way back in 2004. And he did so because he was basically asked by his sub-editor at the 11th hour to add another sentence to a piece that he filed. And he thought about, well, what can we call these new, very, very nascent internet radio blogs, which sound a bit clunky. And he played around with a couple of terms and he sort of said, why don't we call them podcasts? but they could have been called audio blogs. He came up with a couple of different names, but podcast stuck. And the story behind that is in that link. So that's Ben Hammersley. He's responsible. So yeah, I mentioned Ofcom. They reported in 2019, and this inevitably changed, I think, with the way 2020 has panned out. 7.1 million people in the UK listen to podcasts each week. That's 1 in 8. I think what's interesting, I mean, so you could say, well, okay, 7 in 8 don't, and it's still a quite small media. I think what's interesting, though, is that increase up to that September 2019 was a 24% increase, and it doubled in 5 years. So yes, it's still small, but it's growing incredibly quick. Half of listeners have started listening to podcasts in the last 2 years. So there's people coming to the party, they may feel they're coming relatively late. Actually, if we were to roll forward 3 or 4 years, they're actually still at the, more towards the front end and ahead of the curve, as it were. And I think this is a really key one as well. Regular podcast users listen to around 7 per week on average. That suggests that once people start, and once they get into routine, once they get into a regular process and a discipline almost, they become very, very dedicated. They become very, very committed. And I think that's something to remember if you're looking to develop your own media, because once you've got people listening, chances are they will keep listening. One of the things that's really driven it in the last couple of years is the smart speakers. 22% of people who own a smart speaker use them to listen to podcasts, and 1 in 5 homes own at least one smart speaker. So I think there's a suggestion here that the tech-minded people are more likely to listen to podcasts. Now that might pose a challenge if you think, well, most people that we tend to engage with our museum, for example, our heritage collections don't tend to be tech-minded. Perhaps I'm generalising massively here. Well, there's potentially a challenge there, but it does suggest that those people who are a little bit more inclined to buy things like smart speakers are a bit more tech curious then. I think as well that the smart speaker, it's easy. You just ask it to Alexa to call up the newest episode of so-and-so podcast. So it takes away some of the barriers to engagement. So yeah, so it's growing fast. There's still plenty of room for growth though. So here's some breakdown around genre. And what I think is interesting around this, again, 2019 data, is that actually there's not a huge variation. Yes, there is some, but not huge. Now, there's not a section there, there's not a column there that says heritage or sporting heritage. I grant you, it might well be that it was to come under sport, or it might come under society and culture and so on. But what's interesting is that there's a very broadly even sort of split, I would argue, across all different topics. So it's not like people with a particular interest or communities with a particular interest in something are driving the increase in consumption, the increase in availability of podcasts. It tends to be broadly across the piece. So yeah, feel free to chuck some of these into the chat panel about what benefits podcasting could bring to your heritage project or organisation. It might be that you've been given this some thought already. It could be that something, hopefully, the cogs are turning just listening to me now. I've got a few ideas what I think it can do. I've got a few ideas of what it's already done, but I'd be keen to hear what it is that you've got to say. Okay, just responding to Anita's question about average age, there is data for that. There's also data around gender, so more men tend to listen to podcasts than women. They do tend to be a younger audience, but it tends to peak at about early 20s, and then it does sort of tail off. Younger people don't tend to listen, so teenagers now under 25 don't tend to listen to them very often. I think there's a sense that there's a little bit more immediate consumption of media and entertainment, rather than that going to look for something that's been pre-prepared. It's something maybe in that, but it does tend to be broadly sort of late 20s, early 30s. But there's significant consumption within other age groups as well. Reaching a wider audience and leading to more people reading my content. Yeah. Certainly, audience is a big thing, that breadth, and certainly as well, I think, during lockdown as well, when people their availability, their movements have been curtailed. Cardiff's gone into a local lockdown this week. I'm not going to be going to a museum. One of my favourite museums is the Cunnan Valley Museum. It's got a terrific sports collection up in Aberdare. I'm not allowed up there. So, okay, what might I engage, or how might I engage with them if I really wanted to, if they had something I wanted to engage with at this moment in time? So there's something around breaking down some of the barriers, some of the issues of accessibility. So yeah, for us it might bring a new audience, who are not currently connected to museums enjoy the amazing stories we can share. Yeah, I know that there are teachers who are increasingly using podcast media to complement things that they've got in their curriculum around whatever topic it might be, the Romans or whatever. So it might be a good way to make connections with people who have knowledge of my topics. I think one thing that's really, really good, and I come on to this in a moment, is that consider your podcast, if you want to develop and want to take this forward, consider it not as a means just to speak at people. It's just you and your voice, or other people you're involved with in your museum or your collection or something, or your club. It's not just you putting your voice out there. Actually, you're listening. Now, not in an immediate sense, because they're pre-recorded and they go live, but actually there's a sense that you encourage and you invite interaction, that people give you topics to discuss, they offer their wisdom, they share their enthusiasm. I think you can build, I wouldn't say easily, but I think it can happen. You can build a sense of community around your podcast, which I think is great. It certainly helps then in that, helps reinforce aspects of engagement and connection with people. There's an oral historian, interested in getting our stories and history out there. The obvious connection with oral histories, clearly. The podcast we did with the River Row Museum and Francis Horton that went out this week. Catherine Robson from the museum talked a lot about her use of oral histories. And she thinks this is an opportunity to get some of them out there. Maybe as a taster, you're not going to put everything out there, but it could be a taster that brings people in to engage in other things. I was hoping to learn how to make a podcast, but we covered. So perhaps you can tell us once you've recorded, how do you get it out there? We're coming up to how you get it out there. What other platforms, or you can put it on your website, on the web. Okay. Right, a few questions there, Julie. We cover a lot of that. We don't go into the depths of recording. The tutorial does, however, that's coming up in a week or two's time. Yeah, we're going to come on to how you get them onto the web. That's where the SoundCloud bit comes in. So yeah. Hello, I'm from the River. Oh, hello, Natalie. Oh, good. Glad you liked it. Yeah, no, it was really, really good. Rowing's not a sport I know a huge amount, to be honest. And one of the things that I've always said with these things is I learn as much as anybody else. I learn about the topic as any listener is going to in the process of producing these things. So I've learned about goalball, I've learned about shinty. I mean, the shinty episode was brilliant. I've learned about, things about hockey and how hockey was taken to India, for example. These are things I wasn't necessarily aware of. Okay, let's crack on. Thanks for that. So you've mentioned some benefits. Here's what I think can, and what indeed I know is already happening with those people who've engaged and embraced the medium. Yes, you can reach new audiences. You can also reach that mobile audience, and I think that's particularly, the case this year and maybe ongoingly, where you have maybe peripatetic and home-based workers, or you have a dispersed workforce. Where I've done this, for example, with third and voluntary sector organisations, they might have a workforce that's spread out over a whole territory. Wales-wide, for example, is some of the people I've worked with, and they've got a workforce that spends a lot of time in their car. Well, it's an opportunity for people to engage with, learning, engage with the topic while they're, driving between appointments. Yeah, that's a particular key thing. Reaching that unengaged but tech-engaged audience. So it could be that if you are looking to engage with younger people, students, younger people, distance learners, people are already used to maybe communicating in this way. It's been enforced on a lot of us this year, but previously people were quite happy to engage in this sort of way. They're on Instagram and all those sorts of things. Well, then it could be that those people are a sort of demographic that you don't tend to see in your museum. Being on the platforms, being in the media, generating the media that they use and they consume might be a way of being a bit of a shortcut to them. One thing I think is a really good way of a really good thing for doing is demonstrating your values and your authority and your expertise. It shows that you know about something. It shows that you care about maybe inclusion, equality. You care about heritage. You care about all of the things that matter to you within your role and your work. I think that's a good way of doing. It's a good way of. A podcast is a good way of communicating. Good for tasters. That little kind of sprat to catch a mackerel. Give people a taste and see if we can kind of get them hooked and get them in. As well, I think it could be a good medium for reducing complexity. So if you have something that's maybe difficult to understand, or you want to go into maybe a little bit more depth to really uncover the richness of something, then it's a really good medium for that, because it allows you to go in depth, and the timing's perfect because people are asking about the optimal length for a podcast. You know, I've done some that have been over an hour. I've done some that have chats that have gone on 2-3 hours and we've broken them up into 2 or 3 episodes. It sort of depends. It comes back to thinking what is ideal for your audience. Yeah, we come into the audience bit in a moment, but it could be that through necessity, because you have a particularly complex topic and you need to improve understanding, then it could be that you need to go for a little bit longer form. If you're just giving something that's a taster, well then maybe a 15-20 minute podcast is all that you need. So it depends is the answer, which isn't particularly helpful, but put yourself in the shoes of who you're trying to engage and reach, the listener, the audience, your community, and that might help you kind of narrow that down a little bit. So just see if I've missed anything in the chat. Yeah, okay, but I don't think there's anything. Okay. But actually, some more benefits. Exerts a bit more control over your message. There's no filters, retaining your voice. So by this, I mean, you're not going through a press agency, and so to anybody who's maybe involved in a communications role, you can essentially say what you want. Any number of you have probably written press releases that just get sort of, used, verbatim in the newspaper, and that's sort of fine. But certainly in my background in community work, the number of times we've tried to engage local media and they've sort of written their own story, they've missed some of the important points, has been really, really frustrating. It's also maybe an opportunity to cover topics that are ignored by mainstream media. Certainly one of the things I've picked up through working with Sport and Heritage over the years is that, it is hard for some of the sports that are less high profile to get a little bit of a platform, to get an opportunity to share their voice, an opportunity to tell their story, because, the footballs, the crickets, the tennis, et cetera, are a bit more wall to wall. So it could be an opportunity to carve out that little kind of niche for yourselves. There's the element of keeping up with the Joneses. Let's be perfectly honest about it. It's a competitive world out there. We're all jostling for maybe the same visitors and so on. If the Joneses are doing their own podcast, maybe that's a reason for you to do one too. A key thing for me, certainly with my community development one, and certainly the ones I've used when I've developed them as part of a workforce development program within community work in Wales, they're a really good way of sharing learning, because it's a medium that is almost inherently reflective, deliberative, and autonomous. And these are things that are key elements for those of you who've got an educational remit within Heritage and museums. These are words that you probably like to see used, or they're things that you like to see happening through an educational process, where people are kind of questioning themselves, where they're reaching into themselves to think about, okay, well, why do I think this? Why do I know this? How do I know this? And also encourages people to learn a little bit more autonomously. Because listening to podcasts does tend to be on headphones, on the gym, in the gym, on the treadmill. So it does tend to be a very individual podcast. I'm not aware of many people all, gather around as they might do to watch, a TV program or something on Netflix or DVD or whatever, gather around with their friends to listen to a podcast. There might be a connection, and there might be a broader network around that topic and that interest, but it does tend to be a very private and sort of personal experience. So that autonomy, I think, is key. And this concept of an open pedagogy is something I'm really kind of fascinated in and doing a little bit more work around at the moment. I'll come to that in a moment. Pedagogy is defined by the Times Education Supplement as the method and practice of teaching. Learning is at the heart of that. And what DeRosa and Jahangir talk about is an open pedagogy being the site of praxis, a place where theories about learning, teaching, technology, I've emphasized this, and social justice enter into a conversation with each other and inform the development of educational practices and structures. Okay, there's a lot there, there's a lot of words there. But actually, if we look at the words learning, technology, from your point of view in terms of heritage, trying to make stories around maybe disability, around women, around ethnic minorities and so on, voices that don't tend to get heard, there is an element of social justice there. Certainly podcasts become a perfect medium for that. For these things to be elevated, I suppose, into people's awareness, people's consciousness. So I think there's something around looking at your podcast a little bit more than just let's tell a story to a few people that might be interested. But that's fine as well. I'll share this graphic, and if we were spending a bit more time in a workshop environment, I would spend a bit more time and we would maybe do some little exercises around this. But what we've got here is the attributes of an open pedagogy from Tony Bates. I'll send a PDF of this to people. And I think it's a useful tool to help you plan your approach. So this isn't about planning the individual episodes. This is you maybe from today thinking, yeah, I think our museum, I think our heritage institution should develop a podcast. This is what I would suggest you do to plan it. People, openness and trust. Podcasts are inherently people-focused. They involve people. They want to reach people. They want to interest people. They want to stimulate and motivate people. And by doing so in a way that actually is actually quite exposing, you are putting yourself out there. So yes, it's about demonstrating your values and your authority and your expertise on a topic, but people are there to maybe sort of push back and sort of say, I've got a different interpretation. No, I don't agree. And that's kind of fine. But you can develop a sense of trust as well, and build trusting relationships with people through your podcast. And you will reach people inevitably. So there's something around that focus, that emphasis on people and their stories as well. That's another element to this. Innovation and creativity. This could be relatively speaking, so it could be doing a podcast, we look more innovative than everybody else in the heritage sector, for example. But I think actually more than that, it does encourage you to be a bit more innovative in what it is that you want to say, what it is that you want to share, how you want to say it, who do you get in, who do you give a void creative, but potentially so, because you can link it with other things that you're doing. And that could be traditional press and communication strands of media, or it could be a bit more sort of standalone. And certainly your digital story is very much around trying to encourage, the project now is very much around trying to encourage that innovation and that creativity. Sharing ideas and resources, again, because it's about being open, because it's about being trusted and also trusting, it's around wanting to connect with people. Inevitably, ideas get shared. There's a big collaborative community around podcasting. That could be just sharing equipment. Do we all need to go out and spend 300 quid on a mic? Oh no, maybe one of us does, and we all sort of share it, for example, on sort of very practical level. It's around sharing, but it's also around sharing some of those ideas. This is something that we've done with oral histories. Do you want to give that a go? And what I've sensed, and I'm not a heritage professional, but what I've sensed in the relatively short time I've been working with sport and heritage, is that actually, by and large, it's not a very protected empire building sort of sector. People are, they're all wanting to achieve the same things broadly. And so that sharing culture is already there. Podcasts are a great way of just maybe taking that along another kind of step or two. Connected community is around, again, linking your media with other things that you're doing. So it could be fora, it could be message boards, it could be a much more physical sense around engagements with engagement panels and all those sorts of things, so you can connect your podcast with the other activities that you've got. But again, it's also around connecting with people who may never ever set foot in a museum because they live 4,000 miles away, but their great uncle's rowing cap is in the museum, and that's their connection to them and to you. So you can break down some barriers in that sense and generate this sense of community. Learner generated, I think, is key. Any aspect of open pedagogy, let's get away from this didactic, one person sort of standing up and telling you this is how it is. Most learning environments and processes have rejected those sort of old-fashioned approaches. Learner generated, what the people want to learn, and then you just put the stuff out on the podcast. So it could be you don't need to plan a huge amount of content because people are telling you, tell me more about this. Well, why was that? And I think that's a great way of being learner generated, or using your podcast to be a bit more learner generated. Reflective practice. Certainly when I do my community development podcast, a lot of it is around, okay, why did I do what I did? What have I learned through doing how I did it? What will I never do again because it was an absolute disaster, and so on. And that reflection is really, really good. I think it improves us as practitioners in whatever field we're working in. Peer review, okay, pushing it a little bit with respect to this, but certainly, if you want to have a bit more of a professional academic focus to your podcast, great, go ahead, do it. And you can put yourself out there for your other peers to engage and review and push back with what you're doing. But what it shows is that you're open to that you trust people's judgment and so on. Last of all, participatory technology. What we've tried to do with the Sports and Heritage ones is not, I think Justine Riley, for example, has been on one, maybe two of them. This isn't about us showcasing how good and great we are, and it's this kind of very polished communications tool. What it is around giving people an opportunity to participate, and to participate in a way that they want. So we're not mandating, this is how you take part. We try to develop some structure and focus, clearly, because we don't want these conversations, these podcasts to just kind of, just go on and on and on for hours at a time. There's got to be some focus to it. We want to achieve certain things with each episode. But by and large, people are free to participate in the manner that they want. I think that's really, really important. That comes back to that empowerment sort of agenda. So we flash up in the chat. So let's catch up with that. Yeah, okay. So terminology varies, but who do you want to reach? Is it audience? Is it listeners? Is it followers? I think it's a lot about community. Okay, as I said. So one of the things you might want to do, and you might well have done this previously, is you look at things like audience segmentation. You might consider personas. Who are the people that usually come through? Who are the people that don't come through? You might want to kind of develop your podcast in order to reach some or more of those. So who comprises your community? It could be visitors, it could be other heritage professionals and colleagues, obviously the broader general public. It could be academics and learning communities, for example, schools and colleges, but also consider scale. Are you wanting to have just a local remit? Do you want to be more regional, national, or is it perhaps even international? The sporting heritage ones tend to focus on the national, but in each of those, there's also regional context and maybe an international one as well. When they likely listen, I think this is key, certainly with my audience of community workers who tend to be, not exclusively tend to be public employees, they don't tend to be able to, they're not allowed maybe to sit in hot desking environments or large workplaces with headphones on. They can't play it through speakers. So are they going to listen at home? That's a bit of a busman's holiday. Well, they might listen while exercising, but they want to get away from work. So if people are looking to engage with podcasts as a professional thing, then actually making them available during the working time, during lunch breaks, might be what you need to do. So that maybe influences you to keep them a little bit shorter. As I said, it could be while they're commuting, but work hours at the desk, between answering calls. If you're doing something that's quite complex, hour and a half, if your listener's got to tune in maybe, or listen to it in, I don't know, half a dozen settings, then or half a dozen occasions, then maybe the message then begins to get diluted. Consider how they're going to listen. Is it on the smartphone? Is it a work phone? I've worked with people in a professional context who aren't allowed to download certain apps to their phone. So they wouldn't have the SoundCloud app. They'd have to listen on a PC. But workplace cultures, as I said, sometimes militate against that. But what I do think, ultimately, once you've asked these questions of yourself and your potential audience and community, is that their podcasts are resilient to the social distancing restrictions that we're finding ourselves in now. So if you are having to look at a blended offer, then they really do complement that really, really well. But do your community, do your audience want to listen to podcasts? They might already, and it could be that a short survey around people's level of interest might be something you would consider doing. Some people are resistant to a digital by default approach, and I'm very, very sympathetic to that. If there's a feeling that, oh, it's just another way in which everything's going online, but I can never get into the museum or to see the collection, then people might be a bit resistant. So try to remove barriers to the listening. Maybe tell people in advance that you're looking to develop this media and that you need to, in a very much way we've had to help people get literate with things like Zoom, that they are told how to access, that are actually talked through it. But ask them, do they want to listen? Encourage that participatory technology, encourage and develop that sense of community by co-producing the content. Ask them, do they want longer form? Do they want shorter form podcasts? Do they want interviews with experts? Or do they want conversations that are a bit more informal and a bit more free flowing? It could be they want all of that, it could be they want none of that, but ask them and they'll tell you. Are people more inclined to listen if they can be involved? In my experience, that tends to be the case. But for some, it could be what's in it for them. And be prepared maybe to have to make an offer to people to be involved and to listen. So CleanFeed is a platform that I'm using at the minute, and this is something we go into detail with the tutorial. What CleanFeed does, it allows you to record across the internet, top quality sound. So any one of us now, I could send a very, very simple URL link to, and they could click on me and record something very much straight away. So it does get away a lot of the barriers, and it allows you to do it in that socially distanced way. So as I said in the tutorial, we'll go into that in a little bit more depth. Accessibility is something to bear in mind, certainly because we've been doing this disability sport project. Consider accompanying an accompanying transcript for people who are hard of hearing, or maybe for people for whom English isn't their first language. That does help them engage with the media. Given that it's an oral media, then if you can't hear it, then it is a bit difficult to engage. You've got speech-to-text transcription software, but those transcriptions are also useful for quotations. So if you are working in larger environments, sort of organizational, institutional environments, your comm staff already have a go-to list of useful quotes to use on things like social media, press releases, and so on. What's also good is sometimes an accompanying note. This is something we don't really do much with the sport and heritage ones, but I think it's something we probably should maybe up our game with, and it encourages people to further read them. So if you refer to certain texts, certain papers, then actually give people a crib sheet that allows them to maybe explore a little bit further, because they do lack that visual element. So taking your time, take your time. You're not going to nail this perfectly within day one. Within the first episode, it takes time to find your voice and to become comfortable with the medium. Confidence is key. It takes a while for your audience to build up. You will learn through doing. I don't think anyone who's ever been involved in podcasts has come out as an expert and done all the training courses. You really have to learn through doing. And I think the groundwork is important. It comes back to what I was saying in a slide or two a minute ago. Ask people what they want. Tell people that you're going to do it. Encourage them to get involved. Collaborate with them. Ask advice. Listen to other podcasts. All of that will really, really help you put some firm foundations in place. And give your episodes time to be heard. At the end of the day, we all live busy lives. If you put something up today, people aren't necessarily going to be making a stampede to listen to it. It will take time, and you've got to allow that. And you will make mistakes. I've made any number. Forget to turn the mic on. Lost an audio recording. You name it. I've done it. It happens. But use and involve your communications colleagues from the outset, because they've got that comms professional background and discipline, and they can obviously offer a lot of support as well. They'll also get the flack if you said something incorrect or offensive in some way on your podcast. They'll be told about it on Facebook, I'm sure. So I talk about 3 Ps: plan, practice, and pilot. Strike a balance between micro-planning everything and letting it evolve, but set yourself some realistic goals. How many episodes a year? 1 a month? 1 every 6 weeks? 2 or 3 a quarter? How many topics do you want to cover? Do we want to be broad, or do we want to focus on a particular strand and just focus on that to begin with? How many listens or downloads are you expecting? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 100? It will take time to build that up. I always say, 100 people listening to it who don't act on that isn't as good as maybe 3 or 4 people who listen to it, find it fascinating, and then act on something that you've said. They've completed the ask that you've made of them, or they've translated that into a visit or whatever it might be. So quality versus quantity is key. As I said, collaborate and cooperate, reciprocate with others. So get involved in each other's podcasts, because that helps develop those open pedagogies. It certainly helps in terms of sharing resource and capacity. So plan ahead, notify potential guests well in advance. So if I can see Anita's name, if I want to do a podcast with Anita about something she's involved in, I'll send her an email now saying, listen, when in the next 2 or 3 months would you be free to get together? Don't ask them, we need to get one out at the end of this month because the project target says so. Can you do it on Tuesday? Chances are they'll say no. What's also good is to record episodes and put them on the shelf. So you can also sometimes record multiple episodes in single sittings, so that you can kind of get 3 or 4 episodes maybe out of a single sitting with the same guests, because that's a capacity issue. So what I tend to do is record in bursts, edit at leisure. The editing is longer, so then you can take a little bit more time. You don't have to put them out immediately just because you've recorded them. As I said, emphasize the role of the comms colleagues. Practice. Get used to the recording environment. Get used to the editing process. It does take time to get familiar with it. You'll find that certain spaces work better than others. Record a pilot. It may never see the light of day. Here's Johnny Depp from Friday the 13th. Jennifer Aniston from the film that she wishes could be buried and forgotten, called Leprechaun. Very, very bad horror film. They disown it, but you can take it down at a later date. If that pilot is something that helps kind of engage, gets it out there, you can take it down. It may never see the light of day in the first place, but it gives you the opportunity to use the pilot to gauge feedback from colleagues in the wider community. So success, what does success look like? Is it number of listens? Is it your new audiences? Is it complemented strategic aims? Give that some thought. If it's just a vanity game, you just want lots and lots of downloads and lots and lots of listens, great, fine. If you want to be able to reach new audiences, you might need to think, okay, how will we know that that is happening? And you might have other, and this is where this might complement other things that you've got in terms of your strategic planning and strategic development. Evaluate and reflect on each episode after recording. This is really key, I think. Did we prepare well enough? What did we not do so well? How did the guests do? Now, it's not a performative thing, but at the end of the day, if someone comes on, clams up, hasn't got much to say, isn't much of an expert, well, that's going to come through. Why is that? Did the conversation flow? Were my questions maybe not good enough? Ask guests how they experienced it as well. Did they feel out of their comfort zone? A significant element of this is making people feel comfortable. Did we put them at ease? If not, why not? How can we do that better? If people aren't listening, why? Are they too long? Can they find them? Is it too formal and stuffy and academic and difficult and complex? Is the audio quality not up to scratch? So there's an ear fatigue element to it, or because they don't want to. So all of these are things and questions that are worth asking, both at the outset, but ongoingly as well, in an iterative process, an iterative sense. And are listeners acting on your small asks? If you're asking people to do things, are they following those things up? Comments, liking on Facebook, they can be very, very small. Are people engaging on social media is always a good way of checking levels of engagement and the extent to which people are finding them useful and engaging and so on. Benjamin Franklin didn't have a podcast, but he did say that by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. I have a crib sheet that I use and prepare, and I will send this out to people, and it's fairly self-explanatory. It works as a template, so we can all agree what we're trying to achieve with this particular episode. It helps as an aid memoir. It helps people to write down all of the Twitter handles and the Facebook links and everything else, that the website addresses that people tend to forget and under the pressure of recording when that mic is in front of them. You're welcome to use it as a template. It's an open source resource. It can also help secure permissions for guest involvement. It doesn't happen often, but it has happened where people have to get permission to take part in the podcast from their comms colleagues, from their managers, from seniors, and so on. And this helps speed that process up, I've found on occasions. So preparing guests, you'll probably include other people in your podcast. Very rarely a podcast just a monologue, but they are out there, and that's fine, because you want their specific expertise. You want different perspectives. You might want to demonstrate gender balance, because you're collaborating and working in partnership. To involve them, what you like to say, like I said, with the open pedagogy diagram, you need to have, it would be nice to have an opportunity for people to shape their participation, to shape their input. Well, I'd like to say this, because this is a really fascinating story. Fine. They will probably need to prepare, but don't assume they've been involved in a podcast before. Don't even assume that they know what a podcast is, because it's a new technology. Everybody engages with this stuff for the first time. So ask the question of them. One thing to do, keep numbers manageable, because a lot of people can be a bit tricky to manage, because people start talking over each other, or everybody gets really, really polite and they all take their turn, and then the conversation becomes a bit stilted. So start small if you want to, just 2 or 3 people at a time to begin with might help you get into the swing of things a bit more. So let's just skip through a couple of these, talk about the dimensions. So key tips: factor in the time at the start of each recording to chat. Get the conversation flowing, get guests feeling at ease. Reassure them that it's fine to make mistakes. You get tongue-tied, you forget your own name. I've seen that happen. Forget people's job, your own job title and things like that. And you just reassure people that we stop, it's not live, it all gets an edit. I've seen people have a physical reaction. They start going red, blushing, and getting nervous because they're so anxious. That's not going to work. So take as much time as possible, but factor in that time. Don't say, right, we've got 20 minutes, we've got to get this done, because that immediately puts people under pressure. Hold eye contact with people. That's really, really important, particularly in a physical setting. And one of the things I've been doing now all this year, as most of us have, is doing them via the internet on Clean Feed. You lack the body cues, okay? So hold eye contact and reassure them as they're talking. Give people a thumbs up, mouth things like, that was brilliant, well done, things like that. And I always invariably say, we start when everyone is okay to start. This is really, really key, basic, courteous stuff. Okay. Theme tune for your podcast, give some thought to this sort of stuff, but consider copyright. There's a link here to the Free Music Archive where you can use introductory tunes that are fine. So a question, how do you manage editing a guest story? I give people an opportunity, sort of answering Rita's question, I give everybody an opportunity to listen to the podcast beforehand. Sometimes managers, comms colleagues demand that they need to hear it before it goes live, which is kind of fine. We tend to know that by way of the preparation. There's an ethical thing there, and if we had a bit more time, we'd probably explore ethics with all of this. Certainly it's not my right to chop and change and reorder. My editing is around flow between individuals and the flow of people's contributions, and also the audio quality. I'm not there to manipulate somebody's story, and I'm absolutely clear on that. But you can sometimes do that unintentionally. So yeah, it's something to be alert to, and it's great that you've asked that question. Develop a routine and consistency, even if the content is quite varied from episode to episode, and that helps people orientate themselves. So if there is a similar theme tune, there's a similar introduction, it's a similar person, it's the same person hosting it, that helps develop that routine, that consistency. Absolutely need to base them with oral histories and or interviews in a methodological research sort of sense. Don't be shy. Oh, I'm going back. Don't be shy to plug other things. We do this all the time, increasingly now with the Sport and Heritage ones. Plug yourself, plug others, plug your socials, signpost people to previous content, let them know what's coming up. It's that sense of community. SoundCloud uses algorithms to raise profile and send content to people, and I'm encouraging people increasingly to like and leave comments. And plug your colleagues, your partners, your funders. It's a good way of putting a shout out to those. I love these. Sometimes I hear a convo podcast and I'm a bit, you couldn't have edited this even a little bit. I know you're trying to be all raw, but yeah, editing is absolutely key, but it's tedious and it's a bit difficult. But what it does, it shows the quality. It shows that you care about quality. It shows about you care about integrity, and it shows ultimately that you care about the listeners. Got a little funny little excerpts from newspapers there around things. So audio quality for flow, for brevity, sometimes for taste as well. Sometimes, you know, something you said during the recording when you play back just doesn't work, so you kind of take it out, and that's fine. Good volume levels for all participants. You don't want one person who's really, really quiet and everybody else is really, really loud. No distracting background noise. All of this is fairly straightforward. You get people who are ums and ahs. I'm an ummer. I say I'm an awful lot. I'm kind of used to that now. But you have other people who will say things that make perfectly cogent, interesting points, and then we'll end it by saying, so as I said, and then they'll say it again. We don't need all of that. So I tend to edit some of that stuff out if it's just reiterating or re-emphasizing something that's already been said. Ear fatigue, I've mentioned it a couple of times, when listening is hard work. But you do need to bear in mind the quality of people's internet at home when we're recording socially distantly over the internet. That has been a bit of a headache on occasions with me. Okay, I need to rattle through because I want you to get some questions to me. Flow and brevity, less is more. As I say, we don't need it, so get rid of it. Often we go off topic and then you think, well, okay, it helped in terms of the flow of the conversation, but do you know what? We don't really need that. So less is often more. Just because you had 75 minutes of recording doesn't mean you have to put all 75 minutes out. If there's only 35 punchy minutes in it, well, that's all there is. I guess taste is that joke or flippant comment suitable. It was at the time, but listening back, I'm now cringing. I've had a few of those over the years. So I use Audacity to edit, and I will just call that Audacity for the purposes of, this is what you'll get with an Audacity track. It's all gone. There it is. You get this. This is what you have to edit, and this, I have the literacy, I suppose, to understand what a lot of this sort of means. But to the uninitiated, this looks very, very complicated. As in the tutorial, we'll go into this a little bit more. In a more physical, tactile workshop, we'd be going through it in a little bit more detail as well. But Audacity is free, so you might want to get IT permissions to get that downloaded on your computers, if you have to get those sorts of permissions. So here's the SoundCloud, the address for the SoundCloud channel, soundcloud.com/sports and heritage. There's a free tariff and a pro tariff. It's currently at £90 per annum, which is what Sport and Heritage have got. It's available on all the usual kind of platforms and operating systems as you would expect. It's also a very similar interface and lexicon as the main social media platforms. So it talks about sharing, it talks about liking, and all those sorts of things. And let me just call up page. Oops. I can't find it now. Where is it? I'll dig it up in a moment. As Glossary, I will, the handouts, I'll get those all sent to you. Okay, so that's it. I'll call it the channel in a moment. Here we go. So you see lots of things like hearts, and the square is a bit similar to the Twitter retweets and things like that. So yeah, playlists that we've organised. So as the project for Disability Women in Sport, the 2018 conference, Cardiff conference, and so on, all there. And me go back to the next screen. Yeah, so get in touch. Companion guide, which I think Kate's going to talk about in a moment. There's also a session that's going to be looking at some of these media things as part of the online conference, which is 22nd, 23rd October. So 11:30 on day 2, Friday. I think I'm going to be part of that as well, all being well. And yeah, good to hear from you. And best luck with any efforts that you undertake going forward. Diolch yn fawr, thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Russell, for that. The companion guide that Russell mentioned and that we've mentioned a few times in the comments is a pre-recorded tutorial which will take you through. Russell's kind of recorded a very short podcast clip with Belinda, and he's taken you through using Clean Feed, how you send the link out, how you talk to your interviewee, and then he's showing through Audacity how you then edit it. It's about 30 minutes long, but the thinking was that if you have that to hand, you can skip through and you can actually do it alongside the companion, and it's something that you can keep and share with your organisation. So we'll be sending that out, as Russell said. Russell, if you're able to just stop sharing your screen for a moment, I can quickly pull up. It's just a couple of minutes and then we'll go through these questions. Once you have got your tutorial, we'd love for you to just give it a go. I think the thing with podcasting is it seems quite scary, but it's not, and that's what the tutorial will hopefully show you and take you through exactly how to do it. We'd love it if you could just try it. Just make a 2-minute mini podcast on the topic of your sporting story. Russell suggested that actually maybe you could collaborate with somebody else who's been part of this webinar, so you could do it as a kind of interview with somebody here, or you can just do it on your own and just play around with Audacity and the editing tools, and just see how it goes. Send the recording over to me by the 21st of October, and then we can talk about it. We can make suggestions for how you move forward, and hopefully support you on your podcasting journey. But I think just giving it a go will really help. And then just to let you know that we have an extension for this project where we'll be doing more specific workshops. So kind of like this, where it's been quite interactive, but in a webinar format where we go into more detail of digital storytelling, but also community building, online community building, and kind of marketing. If you have any ideas for anything that you would specifically like us to go into, please do email Belinda or myself and let us know. And just follow along at our project page there and see what's coming out. But I think now we can go into some questions. I'll leave that screen up so that you can take down anything. But as I say, we'll send around all of the PowerPoints, this webinar, the tutorial guide, and all of those handouts that Russell mentioned.
Questions. Do people want to, if you raise your hand and then I can unmute you if you have a question?
I am answering privately to a couple that were put in the chat as well.
Are you? Okay.
As well,
That's fine. Anita, I'll just unmute you. Can I do that?
I'm clicking.
Sorry, Anita.
I'm in. I think I'm in.
Yeah, brilliant.
I think I'm in. Yeah, I was just going to ask to Russell. That's brilliant. Thank you. Really helpful. Would you recommend doing your podcast once a week, once a month, or could you just do it ad hoc? I mean, is it better to build a community that knows you're going to get a podcast every week or month or whatever it might be, or does it even work at all if you just do an ad hoc?
I think routine is good. It's disciplining. It's got to be proportionate to the capacity that you've got yourselves. Yeah. So, you know, if you commit to one every fortnight, certainly if they're only even just maybe, 30 minutes long, let alone anything that's more longer form and in depth, like an hour or something, that's quite a lot for preparation. And I tend to do it fairly quickly now. and this is with a straightforward recording, and there's no interruptions, there's no kind of technical problems, mic problems that people get, it probably takes about 5 minutes to edit every 1 minute. So if you've got a 30-minute podcast, or you want 30 minutes, that's let alone the bits that you choose not to keep in it, then do the maths, and it can be a longer process to edit. There's certain shortcuts there, you can maybe compromise a little bit on quality, that kind of thing, but I think routine comes eventually once you've kind of nailed down everything else, and you're getting that interaction as well. I think that's important as well. People will go and listen as and when things arrive, invariably. So I don't think they kind of are sitting there necessarily kind of, tapping the table thinking, hang on, this is not a podcast, it's now 10 o'clock Thursday. Unless, of course, you've told them that's what you're going to do. So I think that comes back to that bit around engaging people beforehand. Yeah. We're thinking of doing this, we're thinking of maybe a month, and I prefer that, particularly when you, as well, I think the other thing that I probably should have mentioned is that I think with Heritage, it's very much similar to community work. There's a huge reliance on the effort of volunteers as well. And I think when you're involving those, you can't necessarily make the demands that you can of staff. Demands is the wrong word, but you know what I mean. Yeah. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about routines so much. One of the things that is really, really important, and it's a bit of a clunky term, I'm afraid, but is RSS. And I think if you were to go, for example, on the SoundCloud channel, each one of the SoundCloud offers an RSS, and what that means is that people who've subscribed automatically get told, so that the episode is brought to people's attention. That's a key thing with podcasts. You don't go looking for them; they come to you. They find you each new episode, and I think that's key. That then does away with that potential barrier of people having to search, or that obligation that you need to be on some sort of rota and routine. It cuts both ways as well, of course. It could be that you've got 2 episodes you want to put out very, very quickly, so you might want to break your routine in that way as well, which would be a great headache to have. But I wouldn't worry too much about it. Certainly we don't with Sport and Heritage. They happen when they need to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Can I ask just a quick second question? How does a podcast differ to tuning into a program on the radio, for example? I mean, I know you choose to listen to the podcast, whereas you get what you get on the radio, but just in terms of, I don't know.
Well, I think things like iPlayer as well, of course, increasingly you can go back and just capture something that was on the radio or TV, for that matter, that you missed when it was broadcasted. It's a lot of time. In that technical sense, not a huge amount. I think it differs greatly where you've got much more control about what you want to say and how you want to say it and who you want to involve saying it. Whereas the radio, you're going through producers, you're going through, lots of other, controls, I guess. You've just got much more freedom and autonomy with a podcast. So on a technical level, not a huge amount of difference, but in terms of the content and that voice, that sense of empowerment and ownership, I think is significantly different.
Much more personal, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and routine as well, I suppose. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, if you can negotiate, weekly slot on, radio, whatever, then great, go for it. I wouldn't say don't do it. It's not. It's different to a podcast, but the chances of getting that regular slot are probably minimal. You might get, the odd window here and there, or the odd program come to visit you, but that for me does feel a lot different in terms of content. But on a technical level, not a huge amount of difference, frankly.
Yeah. Cool, thank you.
That's good. Can you record on your computer? I only ever record on my computer, Julie, to be perfectly honest. You can buy little devices that store the audio for you. Those are particularly good if you're going out and about. If you wanted sort of more field recordings, where you wanted to, capture the voices of a load of school kids coming along to, I don't know, the Roman Amphitheatre in Caerleon, for example, in South Wales, you wouldn't want to lug around a large mic and your laptop. So you can do it in other ways. I tend to just record on my computer because certainly it's just easier for me. I can carry my laptop around with me. Certainly over the internet, having to do things via clean feed in a sort of socially distant manner because we can't necessarily get together, then it is the best, I find. Can you record on your phone? Yes, you can. iPhone's particularly good. Something to bear in mind next time you're watching some sort of press conference, sporting one invariably is good for this, or political ones. You'll see a number of reporters now getting up close, not so close these days, but they've put their phones on the, not dictaphones anymore, it's phones. iPhones have got a really, really good mic, to be fair, and although I use Android and Samsung, iPhones have got a great mic. You can get some really good audio off that, and there are courses out there. I've done one previously around how you get the audio on your phone, and you can record on your phone and get it on SoundCloud within minutes. That's technically a podcast. It's maybe not as polished, but if you want something that's immediate, then it can provide a bit of an authenticity and an edginess to it. So that's okay. But think back to the slide that had those tweets. Yes, we want it to be raw and edgy, but actually it's unlistenable. So you've got to strike that balance. How is it done? Most on an Android, you will have an app that is called Voice Recorder. I'm not sure what it would be called on an iPhone, and it's there as standard. And I'm just finding it now. It tends to be under the Samsung folder. Is that working? S-Voice in the middle. S-Voice is one of them. You've also got Voice Recorder in the top corner. And there it is. I'm not sure. It's a simple record. Records. It stops. You can pause it, or you can stop it completely. Download. You can give it a name. All of this is exactly the same thing that I do with Audacity, with Clean Feed. It's just a lot simpler, a bit more immediate. This mic on this phone isn't as good as the mic I use, invariably, but it does the same thing. It records voice. There's a bit more to this one, but equally, I'm not using this today. I'm using the mic on the laptop, and if you can hear me okay, then your mic on your laptop would be okay as well, by and large, usually. Does that answer that? Is the Sport and Heritage podcast hosted in other places in addition to SoundCloud? So going back to our RSS, we are on Podbean, we are on Spotify, and one of the things with RSS is, and this is why it's important to find a platform initially that allows this to happen. So Audioboom does this. WordPress offers it. So if you have a WordPress website, you can host your podcasts on WordPress. You'll need a plugin. And I know nothing about websites or plugins, by the way, but there's people who do. You need a plugin that is essentially an RSS connection, which then goes out. So people ask me, how do I get it on iTunes? iTunes, or Apple Podcasts as it's now known, doesn't store any podcasts. Not a single one, but there's millions on there. What it does is it drags them in from wherever you've hosted them, and RSS tells them that it's there. So we put a new episode up on SoundCloud that we put up yesterday morning, the Hockey Museum one and the River and Row Museum one. And as soon as they went onto SoundCloud, it, through RSS, told those other platforms that we have a new episode, and it makes them available. So even if somebody subscribes through Podbean or Acast or the myriad of others, once we've connected SoundCloud, or once you've connected your platform to those, they will get that. So they don't even ever have to necessarily go to SoundCloud. They may only ever consume it through the platform that they prefer, and that's just their choice that they're entitled to make. So find somewhere that offers RSS, and I would say for the simplicity to begin with, SoundCloud is probably the best one. But there's plenty out there, and I'm not on commission or anything like that. It's just the one we like. It's working for us because it also offers that interaction with your other social media platforms as well. But most of them do that anyway. There is another one that's slipped my mind. Is it Pick? So the begins with P, but we're on a few of them. We're getting out there. Audacity quite complicated as an inexperienced. It is simpler when you would recommend beginners. No, I think it's the simplest. I mean, it's, horses for courses. I think it's difficult in this, and it's difficult in the tutorial. I mean, whether there's scope to do, another kind of hours workshop online using Audacity. There's lots of, rolling back, I probably have only ever used 30% of its features. That's all I've ever needed. Now, there might be features that I do need, and there might be features that once I discover them, they will blow my mind. But up to now, 30% has been fine. How you become competent in those 30% is the key thing, and how confident as well, that's another key thing. But play around with the audio that you've got. The key thing is, though, that somebody told me this when I was asking people about mic, and they said, don't get a really expensive mic. Because if you get a really expensive mic, it'll pick sound up that you don't have the skills to edit. And I thought, that makes sense. But he said, don't buy a crap mic, because a crap mic just is a crap mic. So I thought, okay, fine. So that's a Blue Yeti. By preparing your space, preparing your guests, preparing the content, means you have less to edit further down the line. Calamities always happen, don't get me wrong. Interruptions always happen. But by preparing better and more thoroughly, you've actually, in the longer run, got less to edit, if that makes sense. It's one of those things that, yes, you need to get practicing, learn through doing, which is kind of my learning style anyway, but I do find that you've got, what's the PDF software? Adobe have got a basic one. I've used it once or twice. GarageBand is another one that's actually quite good. I know somebody prefers that, but that's because they're coming to podcasting from a music recording background. So they're already familiar with it. So it swings around about, I suppose, what you're familiar with and what you're used to. You can also use Audacity to record as well. So you can record straight into, so I use Clean Feed usually. You can also record straight into Audacity, which again is just a bit more of it's a shortcut as well, which kind of helps to begin with. So if there's any other questions on there. Mess. Not sure there's anything else in there. So much of the interview is similar to an oral history interview, yeah. It could be, Katie, that podcast player hasn't been one that we've got around to trying to connect with yet, to be honest. There's tons out there, and some of them can be a bit fiddly as well, to be perfectly honest. But I've got a list that Kev's given me that I'm working my way through, slowly but surely. Yeah, I can make a note of that one and try and get on podcast player. iTunes tends to be the one, or Apple Podcasts is it now. Sky have got a new podcast thing I noticed the other day, so that's what we need to kind of get on as well. You never keep ahead of the pack with these things, man. That's one of the other challenges. So if you do always try to, then you're forever just trying to keep up with them. So you have to draw a line somewhere.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I think we'll probably wrap it up now. But thank you, Russell, for that. It was really valuable. And combined with the companion, I hope that you'll all feel ready to start recording and giving it a go. And thank you all for joining us. It's been great to have you here, and thank you for all the questions as well. It's been a really interactive session.